Well, good afternoon from London. Good morning from New York. Really delighted to have the session today welcoming Jeremy Tamanini, founder of the Global Green Economy Index, to talk to us about satellite-based sustainability data, and properly described as a new frontier. It really is leading-edge work that's being done in using space data. I'm Mike Wardle, be chairing today's event. I'm the CEO of the ZN Group. Some of you may have met me before, some of you may not, but it's very good to see you all here at this event. A few housekeeping notes. First of all, the session's being recorded, so that if you have friends and colleagues who you think might be interested in the event, the recording will be posted online within about 48 hours, so you can share that around. A brief word to say many thanks to our sponsors. We are delighted that we're able to range quite far and wide over the areas of finance, economics, innovation, science. We can only do that thanks to the support of our sponsors, and many thanks to them. The format today is very simple. My job is to get out of the way pretty quickly, so we can hear from our keynote presenter. Just to say, there's a Q&A session towards the end of today's agenda. If you've used the GoToWebinar site before, you'll know how this works. There's an area on your dashboard where you can type in questions, which will come to us, and I will field those to Jeremy at the point when we get to Q&A. You can put your questions in at any point during the session, so if there's anything that strikes you, just put them down onto the question list, and we'll pick those up later. The final point on the questions: if you ask a question, we will send your email contacts to Jeremy afterwards, so if there's any follow-up discussion that might be useful, that's a possibility. But it's a real delight to welcome Jeremy to talk to us this afternoon. I've known about Jeremy's work for quite a few years when I was setting up the Global Green Finance Index. Not long after that, Jeremy came across our sites when he was developing the Global Green Economy Index, and we've been tracking each other's progress during the course of those years, and I was delighted that we were able to meet up in London earlier this year. Jeremy, it's a real pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to your presentation, and I'm now going to get out of the way. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that introduction. It's really a real pleasure to be here today. I'm going to just quickly set up my PowerPoint. As Mike mentioned, I am a consultant based in the United States, in New York City, working for over a decade now at the intersection between sustainability and data. And I've learned so much from this webinar series, Mike, that you have so much diversity in the topics that you cover. So I'm honored to be here today to talk about satellite-based sustainability data, which I do believe is a new frontier. I hope that everyone else agrees after my short remarks. And it's true what Mike said, we connected through this shared focus on indexing. The Global Green Finance Index, as many of you may know, is a really interesting viewpoint on sustainable finance capitals and what they're doing. The Global Green Economy Index is a bit different. We are looking at the country performance in the global green economy as defined by 18 indicators, which you can see here. They range from climate change and social equity indicators, indicators related to sector decarbonization, so sectors like buildings and transportation, how carbon efficient are they? Markets and ESG investment, and of course environmental health, air quality, forests, biodiversity, oceans, etc. So what we do here, and this gets into our discussion about data and the quality of data, is we, for each of these indicators, are looking at two main factors. So the first one is progress. So what progress has each country made from 2005 to the present on these different indicators in the GGEI? And at the same time, what distance does their most recent value have from global sustainability targets related to emission reductions, sustainable development goals, etc. So for example, in the UK, I imagine many of the attendees are in the UK today, A simple green economy indicator like greenhouse gas emissions per unit GDP, what kind of progress has the UK made over the past 15 years in terms of making that value better, more efficient? And then where does the UK stand today relative to global targets or the UK's commitments to processes like the UNFCCC and the upcoming COP? So that's what we do. Data is our entry point, if you will, into this topic of sustainability and green economy. So as data is the entry point to our viewpoint on global green economy, there are some challenges right now related to sustainability data, and they fall into kind of three buckets, I would say. The first one is accuracy. So are the data that we're working with actually accurate? A lot of times they're not. Sometimes when you see data that is linked to the year 2020, it was actually collected in 2017. So there are issues there related to accuracy. Timeliness. Are the data current or are they out of date? Are some data for some countries from a year ago and others are from 5 years ago? If so, how do you make comparisons? And then of course, coverage. So what kind of data coverage do you have across countries or across jurisdictions, but even within countries? So for example, we might know overall what the greenhouse gas emissions are for the UK, but how do they break down in a more localized manner? What are the differences between greenhouse gas emissions per unit GDP in Greater London versus Greater Manchester, or between UK urban areas and more rural areas? So these three challenges are really important to understand and to improve upon for all kinds of reasons. And I'm going to get into some of those reasons as we talk about satellite-based data. So first of all, like what we work with now, and many people will be familiar with these kind of charts where you can see kind of how a country like China or the United States or the EU compare on emissions. And we generally have these views, these high-level views of how performance is. But it's important to understand that a lot of this is generated from what we think of as a bottom-up approach. There's almost kind of an old-fashioned approach to generating these measurements. People in forests actually giving, general estimates of forest cover, looking, more manually at power plants and making estimates based on that of emissions from power plants. And this bottom-up approach is very much the approach used through the UNFCCC process. Researchers have noted recently that there's some problems here in terms of coverage, in terms of how accurate these measurements actually are. And in a major way, some researchers have estimated that annually we're missing somewhere between the total emissions of the United States and China in terms of what we're capturing. That's a big deal. That's a lot of emissions. That's changing the baseline that we're using to project a lot of forward-looking calculations around risks, climate risks and impacts. So we need to get that right. We need to rectify that. So satellites offer a way into this problem. And I'm going to start with my first case study. I have 3 case studies, and the first one is a company called Climate Trace. It's actually a consortium. It's a nonprofit consortium. I think there's about 50 organizations that are part of it, and all of these organizations are using satellite data to look at a different piece of the emission story. Some are focusing on industry, some are focusing on landfills, some are focusing on forests, some are focusing on cities or transportation. So everyone's kind of doing their own thing in terms of collecting these measurements, all using satellite-based data to formulate them. And then what Climate Trace is doing is putting them all together in a platform, a dashboard. It's publicly accessible. I encourage everyone to look at it, use their data. see how their data perhaps gives a more granular viewpoint on, for example, in the UK, if you wanted to look more specifically at a sector, or within a sector, what different assets within that sector are doing in terms of their emissions portfolios. That's the kind of thing that Climate Trace can do. And they're using artificial intelligence and machine learning in interesting ways because they're gathering all of this imagery that they are taking from satellites, and they're teaching computers to decipher and to begin to make predictions around how different images link to different levels of emissions. So for example, if you have visible light measurements from satellites that are detecting steam from a source of energy production, how can computers begin to understand patterns and configurations of that steam as a way into predicting the emissions associated with it? So this is one example where I think there's potential for disrupting or thinking differently about this bottom-up approach to emissions measurement and using satellite-based technology to do more of a top-down approach, and then comparing how those numbers are relative to one another and looking further in why some of the gaps may exist. So moving into renewable energy, there's another very interesting initiative called Global Renewables Watch that just launched here in New York at the Climate Week at the UN General Assembly just a few weeks ago. And Global Renewable Watch is also a consortium between Microsoft, Planet Labs, and the Nature Conservancy. And they're looking at renewable energy installation, solar and wind. And they're using satellites to better understand where these installations are happening, how they have performed over time, what type of land use patterns have emerged around them. So for example, at a utility scale solar installation, has it led to certain forms of development around it? If so, what are they? And in an important way for investors and project managers, this Global Renewables Watch will give a lot more confidence and transparency to investments in utility scale solar and wind. So project developers now have interesting tools to look at different sites and understand what their potential is from a solar point of view, solar energy production point of view. But we don't always know whether those are borne out over time. So what this project will allow investors to do is to have an atlas. So it's going to be a fully publicly available atlas of renewable energy installation where they can start to leverage this satellite-based data to better understand how these different renewable energy projects have performed over time, where they are, and how that impacts their own formulations around their own renewable energy projects in the future, which we hope there are many. The third and last case that I wanted to give has to do with land use, forestry, and this growing sort of voluntary carbon markets related to net zero commitments. I encourage everyone to look at a tool called Global Forest Watch, which is shown here, tracking forest fires throughout Latin America. It's, in a way, for me at least, back 5, 6, 7 years ago, was one of the first tools relative to forestry that was really mainstreaming this use of satellites to understand deforestation and land use patterns. And what has happened in this space since forestry and land use vis-a-vis satellite-based monitoring and measurement, I would say, is perhaps more evolved than some of the other realms, is that you're already seeing really interesting commercial uptakes that are leveraging these satellite-based data. So I wanted to give the example of NCX, which is a US-based organization working in this space, building a platform much like the renewable energy platform and the emissions platform that Climate Trace are working on. But their platform is all about connecting net zero companies to forest landowners in the United States. So again, satellites are at the base of this. Instead of basing carbon credits on this more old-fashioned counting method of how much each credit is worth in a given forest area, NCX is looking to satellites to do a more in-depth mapping of different forest zones so that we can understand much more clearly what that carbon credit is worth, how much carbon is there, how can we look at each element of the forest community under question with a lot more detail and a lot more granularity. These are things I think I'm repeating a bit here around granularity and detail. This is something that in all kinds of realms of the green economy, satellites are giving us a much deeper view into that. And so then what happens? Well, what happens is that NCX and platforms like theirs not only allows for more landowners to be involved and to tap into this system, but it also attracts more net zero companies into the system because the carbon credits are viewed as being more high quality, more transparent, and just much more kind of confidence emerges around using them as part of net zero planning and carbon offset markets. So I think NCX is one example of many where we can start to see platforms like Climate Trace and the renewable energy platform being used by private entities to start to develop commercial opportunities and hopefully scale a lot of this work. So before we open up to questions and discussion, which I'm very much looking forward to, I just wanted to bring it back to my first slide around the Global Green Economy Index and the question of like, sort of why do I care about all of this? You know, I am not an expert in satellites. I am not an expert in deciphering the nuances of satellite-based measurements, but I am working in the realm of sustainability data. And back to the first slide around the challenges that I see, I really want in this decade for sustainability data to be more accurate, to be much more timely, and to have much more in-depth coverage. Because if that happens, platforms like the Global Green Economy Index can become even more actionable for our partners. They can tell a much more complete and accurate and timely and nuanced story about these 18 indicators related to the Global Green Economy Index. So that's just sort of my interest in this topic. And of course, I encourage everyone to look up the other organizations and companies that I mentioned, because I think that they have a lot to share with all of us. So with that, I will turn things over to Mike to continue the discussion.
Well, thank you very much for that. A really fascinating insight into some of the shifts that are taking place in the way that the data is being managed in the space. I guess the first question, I guess, is kind of who owns this data? Is this kind of public good, and how far can we trust the kind of the people using space data to give us, you know, the answers which actually we need to make sense of what's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a mixture. I would say in the past, it's been much more the domain of governments. And so if we talked about this 5 or 10 years ago, we would definitely be talking mostly about government-sponsored satellites with different levels of access and transparency. You know, in the United States, we have NASA, Landsat, and NOAA, and entities like that that have been using US run satellites for a while now, but it is becoming more and more of a commercial space. It's becoming a more crowded space for sure. The biggest owners of commercial satellites today are SpaceX followed by OneWeb Satellites and Planet Labs. Planet Labs was part of that consortium I mentioned with Microsoft and Nature Conservancy looking at renewable energy installation. So it's moving to be a much more crowded, busy space. And as you mentioned, as part of that, you start to get into the issue of both ownership and access, but also, you know, the politics of that. Who has access? How do they have access? Is it fully commercialized versus open source? And I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg with some of those debates.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I've got a question from Jemima Mwanda, who's a PhD student from Uganda. Is just asking, could you give a bit more detail of the type of data that you use to build the Global Green Economy Index? So maybe just a couple of examples of the kind of data sets that you
No, it's a great question. We use data from international data platforms that are collected and verified through primarily the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Energy Agency. These are, you know, they're important because you want to have as much confidence as possible in the data that you collect. We're starting to see on some of the environmental topics. So for example, with air quality, we're starting to see some development there around sensors where some of the measurements are starting to be taken more frequently and across more sites based on the ability of sensors to capture air quality. And then in terms of investment, you know, we look at a lot of the large, like Bloomberg New Energy Finance, some of the intellectual property organization has a lot of data related to green patents. And so to answer the question, you know, we're right now still in this, you know, more traditional model where the GGEI data comes from these internationally recognized databases. And of course, as I said at the end of the presentation, I hope to see how satellite-based data interacts with that in the next decade to hopefully add more rigor, recency, and accuracy to the data that indices like the GGEI collect.
Sure, I think, you know, one of the things that we will see, and we are starting to see, is future-looking finance. If I can use that phrase, which I've just coined, but people like insurers and, you know, venture capitalists who are looking towards the future, starting to use this kind of data to look at water usage, sea level change, as you mentioned in your presentation, forest fires. They become important signals as to the risk that people are facing going forward. I've got a question from Guy Mayo in the audience. Given that, he says, given the large geopolitical power blocks have very different long-term visions and are in competition, and despite the various interdependencies that exist in the global markets, just wondered whether you see carbon emissions becoming sort of weaponized, and if so, does satellite data play a part in countering that weaponization?
Great question, huge question. I think there are a lot of pieces to it. I mean, I think emissions in a way have already become weaponized in our global economy. When you think about how interconnected production is, you could definitely argue that China, and in producing a lot of goods consumed in the United States, you know, China's taking the hit for those emissions, even though the consumption is happening in a different country. You know, Norway scores very well on the Global Green Economy Index, but they are exporting a lot of oil and gas that's then consumed in other countries. So those cross-border effects are already in play, I would say, in terms of the politics of emissions and green economy. I think that it will only continue as the climate crisis intensifies, as countries' policymakers use things like trade policy to impact these issues. And I think satellites, I think the question is very important. You know, like do we need, some sort of body now or soon that's an intergovernmental body to manage and regulate and sort of set the rules of satellite-based data? Who can access these data? For example, if there's a satellite that's funded and managed through one government, does everyone have the right to access it? Do only citizens of that country have the right? If it's a commercial satellite, obviously there's an underlying business model there. Should we all have to pay to access it? It gets into a lot of equity issues, right? Because if you start to really just look at this as a market, you may have certain actors taking advantage, and actors could be private actors, they could also be countries, and trying to use the transparency or to use these to their advantage in ways that might diminish the value that currently they can give around transparency, with data transparency. So great question. I wish I knew the answer, but I think it begs the discussion soon about how we manage this as a global community.
Sure. I mean, I think it's something we've picked up on and we've been arguing for some time, is the use of sustainability linked bonds to raise money both at the sovereign level and at corporate level. And these are bonds linked to the outcomes rather than to the use of proceeds. And one of the issues there is how far you trust the measurement
Right.
of reduction in emissions if your bond is linked to that or to whatever. And I guess better open data sources is really the answer to be able to give assurance to people that those kind of ways of investing
Yes.
are safe.
And Mike, just quickly, I think that's a great example of how this discussion links to commercial decision making. Like the example I gave about NCX with carbon offsets, it's a similar discussion. It's like a lot of companies just did not have confidence, still maybe don't have confidence in the quality and the measurability of carbon offsets, and satellites have added granularity. So to your point about sustainability linked bonds, investors are going to want to know what, they want to have confidence in the underlying metrics. And if the underlying metrics are based on a baseline that is off by a pretty big factor, that has a big impact on the confidence in these types of bonds.
Sure. So the linked question is, did you think the data coming out of these sustainability satellite-based systems could be employed in emission trading scheme compliance? And that's, I mean, I see there's great scope for it. But where do you think emission trading sort of sits alongside this kind of data provision?
I think it's a very similar, it's all kind of part of the same underlying issue, which is how do we integrate, how does the global community transparently integrate this dimension, this new viewpoint of satellites into our underlying baseline that we use for all of these systems. So I think carbon trading markets are one such system where there's a certain underlying measurement that exists that defines how they function and how carbon is priced. Are those accurate? Are those timely? Do we have confidence in those? The same exact issue that's facing companies buying carbon offsets. It's the same exact issue facing buyers of sustainability linked bonds. So it's tricky because we have all of these different tools that are emerging, be they in the investment community, be they companies, be they part of the broader sort of sovereign negotiation around emissions and reductions. And yet we don't have a discussion underway around the underlying accuracy, and then of course this new frontier. So I don't know where that begins, but I think it's a matter that we'll be hearing about more in upcoming negotiations and such.
Yeah, Guy's followed up his rather his complex question with a question of how do you instill trust where there is none? And that's a really big question. But I'll make an attempt at answering this. The answer is you talk to people. You actually have to have engagement with people across borders, across between governments, and to try to build up that trust by knowing people. It's a difficult thing to do, to build trust, but it's always something you should worth trying. There's another answer to this, is that you build interdependency. Mm-hmm. There's a concept that's has been developed by one of our contacts, Professor Alexander van der Putte, who works in Kazakhstan. But the concept of is a renewable energy connected to the internet. The idea that somewhere in the continent of Eurasia, the wind will be blowing or the sun will be shining, and if you managed to link up the whole of the subcontinent, you'll be able to transfer and move energy around to where it's needed. And if you have those kind of interdependencies in place, apart from rogue actors, actually it's more likely that you instill trust because people rely on each other. Yeah,
and I would add that, we take certain institutions, the World Trade Organization is a good example. We take institutions like that for granted as if they've sort of always existed. But always throughout history, you have these this necessity for new forms of cooperation, new forms of sort of validating approaches, forums that everyone opts into and agrees to. We've seen that with the COP. I think the COP has become, for better or worse, one such forum within climate negotiations. Maybe we need to see that in a certain form for data. Maybe it's something that has to emerge out of a process like COP, or maybe independently, where we had some sort of like WTO for data, where countries, companies, everyone opts in to a certain set of rules that we can enforce and monitor and penalize over time as another form of incentivizing cooperation.
I guess the question that comes to mind for me is, if here you are as someone who's really engaged with sustainability data, which bit of data would you really like to have your hands on that you really can't get a handle on?
Oh, that's interesting. I think the data that would fall in that category would probably have to do with the environmental sphere. Oceans would be one example. I mean, we think about oceans, we think about fisheries, we think of underwater biodiversity, we think of coral reefs, we think of the oceans are such an enormous part of our system, the carbon balancing system of the Earth. There are also some enormous percentage of the Earth's surface. I don't remember the exact number, but it's way higher than people think. But we don't have the granularity that we need around oceans, and I think that it's to me kind of a missing link. And in the Global Green Economy Index, we look at oceans in the context of Sustainable Development Goals, biodiversity underwater, things like that. But I would love to understand coral reefs like with a lot more granularity. How healthy or unhealthy are they, and what is driving that? How's that affecting underwater biodiversity? How's that affecting livelihoods, economies that are linked to fisheries? So I would say oceans, and beyond that, just other environmental topics. I think land use, just broadly, I think a lot of progress has been made, but that would be a really interesting area to just have a lot more data and granularity.
Another question from James Mwanda in Uganda, just looking at the future of the green economy and given the relationship between climate change and business, how do we shift business away from their focus on profit maximization towards a focus on contribution to climate? Because, I mean, there was some recent research showing that still the #1 thing that drives business decisions is profit. Even those businesses would claim they were interested in sustainability.
Look, I mean, speaking from the United States, this is a lively but frustrating topic. There was, I mean, the Business Roundtable a few years ago came out with a statement around really shifting the viewpoint from a shareholder focus to a stakeholder focus. What they mean by that, by stakeholders, are customers, they mean employees, they definitely mean communities that they're in, and there's absolutely a green economy piece to that. As many things in the United States these days, that shift was seized upon by forces that are hostile to that approach, and things were kind of turned on their head, and there was a lot of criticism about how this was saddling businesses with responsibilities that they really shouldn't have. Of course, we also have external interventions, and that's what can be so frustrating about green economy, is that you think you're all kind of like making progress and moving in one direction, and then you have a disruption like the pandemic or like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where rightly so, the global community has to react and has to deal with very real issues related to energy or related to economics. So I don't know. I mean, to be perfectly blunt, you know, this is the question of the day in terms of like how real this issue is being taken by leaders. I mean, one of the things that one realizes in the green economy space and with being so close to data is that it's a very paradoxical space to be in. I mean, Mike knows this, and we were talking about this in London, like there's so much innovation happening. Actually, I learned about sustainability linked bonds for the first time from Mike in London. I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And I looked it up and I saw Chile had one. And I think there was one in a country in Africa, the Seychelles maybe. And I thought, okay, great innovation. Same thing with, I mean, there's so much innovation and newness happening, and to credit companies and investors as well. It's happening in those spheres. It's not that those stakeholders are enemies of the green economy, but when you're close to the data, you then see in the same breath how the top line trends continue to get worse and worse and worse. And that's the paradox. It's like, how are those two things reconciled? And I don't know. I don't know how they are.
And I suspect the real answer is until we start pricing carbon properly in the market, things aren't going to change. In other words, until climate change affects the bottom line in a serious way, either through taxation or other methodologies, I suspect the answer is that we won't crack that one. There has to be a market response, I think.
From your mouth to the US Congress's ears. I mean, I remember in 2010 with the first Obama stimulus package, you know, carbon pricing was on the table. It was a discussion that was alive and well, and it has not gone anywhere in this country.
No. And it hasn't gone anywhere actually, you know, across the world yet. But if I were at COP in Egypt coming up, that's the conversation I'd be having with everyone there. We're almost out of time, Jeremy. So just remains for me to thank you for your contribution, to thank our audience for attending and for their engagement and questions, to thank our sponsors once again for enabling us to put on these series of events, and to remind you that a recording of the event will be up on our site and available to you. The slides that Jeremy used are already up on the site on the events page, so you can go and find those. And just a few words about forthcoming events. We've got an event tomorrow on dealing with difficult people at work with Raj Basul, talking about the psychology of how you manage difficult people. I'm sure none of us have got difficult people to deal with at work, so we won't be turning up for that one. Tomorrow evening we have an in-person event, a US midterm election panel discussion in London, because we are actually interested in what happens in US politics, and a discussion with people who are really plugged into what's happening in the US. On Wednesday, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Metaverse. For those of you who have not engaged with the Metaverse yet, come along and find out. And next week we're having a session on international share schemes, how to export the vision. So a packed agenda as always. You can find details of our events if you go to the links on the slide. So once again, Jeremy, many thanks for your engagement this afternoon. It's been a delight. In a normal event, I'd be able to throw this open to a tumultuous round of applause. Instead, you get a very small one.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation.
And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jeremy, once again. We'll see you again soon.